We've heard some lovely things about the power of presence this morning, and I was thinking in my own life, it's really been teachers that showed me a level of presence that really profoundly impacted me and stayed with me to this day. So I'm going to, I think, pay tribute to one of those teachers in just a moment. But listen, in the interest of truth-telling, I also have to say that I had several teachers along the way who I can only politely describe as memorable. There was the avidly patriotic second grade teacher who always wore red, white, and blue attire, right down to miniature flag earrings, American flag earrings. There was the ninth grade biology teacher with wild Albert Einstein-esque hair who sang opera at full voice while we dissected frogs. And really, the worst one of all was the fourth grade math teacher who ranted about politics instead of teaching us math and had, I hate to say it, but a chronic nose-picking problem. Fortunately, the teacher I'm going to tell you about today, Mrs. Green, was unremarkable by comparison. So one summer when I was a teenager, we moved to a new house, and that meant I would soon be going to a new school. And being the kind of boy in Indiana who preferred listening to Broadway show tunes as opposed to playing basketball, you can imagine fitting in at a new school was not exactly easy. Maybe some of you can relate. So as I counted down those last nights of summer before school began, I'd often sleep lightly, awakening when the nightly train passed by, its whistle like a warning, really, of the inevitability of new things to come. So sometimes I'd lie in bed and I'd look through a book that had been given to me at my previous school. The inscription inside read, "To Jason, a young man who has every reason to believe in himself, love, Mrs. Green." Now, if you'd asked me about Mrs. Green on those sleepless nights punctuated by that train whistle, I would have described her as some kind of school librarian superhero, minus the cape. Mrs. Green her library was the place that I could go and know that I was valued, loved even. So I spent a lot of time in that library, shelving books, working the checkout desk, and through it all, Mrs. Green was there for me. Just there. So this idea is called presence. Instead of focusing on doing all the time, it focuses on being. Being present with full and loving attention. Unitarian Universalist theologian Paul Razor says that the world is an organic whole. Nothing can be understood or experienced in isolation. So if it's true that we're fundamentally connected in this way, then could practicing presence help to transform the world into a better place? And I say yes, as you can imagine, as I'm giving this sermon for this very reason. So the power of presence really hit home for me a few summers ago when I was still in seminary. And I went to the high school age church camp. And we seminary students would witness youth ministry in action. That was the reason that we were there. So as I headed off to camp up in the mountains, I was driving there and realizing that it had been over a quarter of a century since my first and last time at camp. So as I was preparing this sermon for all of you, I was talking to my family about that experience all those years ago, and my mother, in the way that only mothers can do, from some dark corner of our attic, managed to find the letter that I wrote home from camp all those years ago. She must save everything. I am a little scared. So here's my letter from all those years ago. Dear Mother and Father, I am now at camp. I do not like the food, and they make you play dodgeball. I do not like dodgeball. Some of the kids are nice, but that could change. It has only been 2 days, but it feels like a long time. Come and get me as soon as you can. Sincerely, Jason Mark Cook. I guess I needed to make sure that they knew it was me, you know. So there I was, you know, 25 years later, 25 plus years later, driving up that twisting and turning mountain road to camp and realizing I was going to be there for 24 hours a day for 7 days. And honestly, I can tell you, I almost turned the car back around. But I didn't, and so what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've written a few letters in that same style of that first letter to sort of share with you what my experiences were at camp a few summers ago. Dear Mother and Father, I am now at camp. It sure is beautiful here, and so far there has been no talk of dodgeball. However, walking into a lodge filled with 100 teens made me wonder, what have I gotten myself into? But more than that, what on earth do I have to give them? But here I am, anyway, determined to simply be present as I'm being taught and see what happens. But I have to keep reminding myself that I am enough as I am, as it's still easy to fall into the trap of thinking that to make a difference in someone's life, I have to be a one-person show, funny and warm and wise all at once, while profundities drop like pearls from my lips. The thought of it is mentally exhausting. On top of that, I am physically exhausted. I'm staying in a cabin with the other seminary students, and the person sleeping in the bunk above me snored all night, which I don't think is a polite thing for a fledgling minister to do. Plus, they say there are mice in our cabin, and I tripped over a rock. Come and get me as soon as you can. Sincerely, Jason Mark Cook. So listen, that's the way I felt as I made my way down to the lodge for my first breakfast there. I sat down at a table with a group of reluctantly awake teenage girls. I said hello, got some half-hearted responses, and while we ate there was a little conversation, but I didn't push it. One of the girls in particular looked very bored by our exchange. In fact, I was pretty sure she rolled her eyes a few times, but I took a breath and did my best to stay present as I had been taught. So just a couple of nights later, after that uneventful breakfast, I was surprised to find myself approached by this same girl, but this time, no eye rolling. There's this radiant smile stretching across her face. She takes my hands in hers and says the conversation at breakfast was one of the best she had ever had. She'd been having a rough time lately, she said, and that interaction had given her hope for the future. I was speechless. What had I done? We just talked a little bit about our lives. It had been ordinary, everyday me, and the point is it could have been anyone in this room practicing the idea of presence that had made such an impact. Now, if I hadn't been taught to do that, I might just have told myself, oh, I'll give them their space, and I might have ignored them, or I might have tried to fill the silence with talking in a desperate attempt to give lasting meaning to our time together. But instead, I was just present, and that ended up being a life-changing breakfast for a teenage girl, and for me too, it turns out. You know, I doubt if all the Mrs. Greens, Mr. Greens, Ms. Greens have any idea of the power of their simple, instinctive gifts of presence. But these ordinary people are the ones that got so many of us through when we thought there wasn't a place for us in this world. Being present is the way that we deal with what theologian Sharon Welch calls cultured despair, which refers to the privilege that, comfortably, pretty well-off folks have in just opting out of working to make the world a better place because it can seem overwhelming. Being present across differences is that step that we have to take in order to fight off that despair. And that's a countercultural move in today's world. So as my week at camp progressed, my letter would have sounded a little more like this. Dear Mother and Father, so far there hasn't been any talk of dodgeball, but there has been talk. I've seen that willingness of our youth to be vulnerable and real with each other in order to connect. And witnessing that reacquainted me with who we are as Unitarian Universalists. We are people who practice love. In our youth, we can see the radical evolution of the two traditions from which we come. Unitarianism, which said that what mattered most was how you lived your life, not necessarily what you believed, and Universalism, which denied that a loving God would condemn anyone to hell. Unitarianism and Universalism conveyed the heretical notion that we are good enough and worthy enough, flaws and all. Our youth instinctively feel this core message as Unitarian Universalists. And what is that message in its simplest form? You are loved. You are loved. It's a call to action, for if we believe you are loved to be true, then for it to be true for our neighbor, we must also love our neighbor to ensure its truth. Notice it's not I am loved. You are loved requires us to be in relationship with each other. It's something we must say and demonstrate from the simple act of welcoming folks into the epic sweep of justice making. And even the atheists among us agree that if a God were to exist, the only God worth believing in is the one who loves all. We've raised our young people to understand that as UUs, you can be female or male or lesbian or gay or transgender or heterosexual or black or white or disabled or any other thing, and we can affirmatively tell you that, yes, you are loved. Loved by this community, loved by God, loved into being by the natural miracle that is birth itself. There's lots of food for thought here, but I'll tell you that snoring from the bunk above me is distracting, even though I slept through a train whistle for all those years. So come and get me when you can, but there's no hurry. Sincerely, Jason Mark Cook. Our youth teach us that we need to practice loving each other because we can't spread our message of change out there if we don't feel this loving connection deep within ourselves. And sometimes we naturally get so caught up in the hustle and bustle of everyday life that we can forget to be present to each other. And when we stop doing that, we also stop building the community that we need to be strong, to deal with whatever may come our way. As I learned on those sleepless nights as a teen, a train is coming one way or another. We can hear it whistling in the distance. So telling you about teenagers reminds me of my high school friend, Wendy. All those years ago, I'll never forget the first time I saw her, first day of school. Wendy walks in, all the other kids sit down at a desk. Wendy goes over and sits at a table. The French teacher, Mrs. Madrigal, asked her to move to a desk. Wendy says, "I'd rather not," very matter-of-factly. "It'd be a nice change of pace to sit at this table. Besides," she added, pointing to this withered potted plant in the center of the table, "if you let me sit here, I'll take care of this plant." The formidable, steely-eyed Mrs. Madrigal stared at Wendy while the rest of us held our breath, amazed at her audacity. Finally, Mrs. Madrigal shrugged and said, "Fine, you can sit there, but take care of the plant." I knew I had to have Wendy as my friend after that. But, you know, she wasn't an easy girl for teachers to like, with her ubiquitous black clothing, studied look of indifference, reluctance to participate in class. But she did nurture that potted plant, bringing it back to life, so that Mrs. Madrigal said, "Oh, c'est magnifique," and begged her to take it home for the upcoming summer vacation. "We'll see," Wendy said, hiding her enthusiasm, of course. The only time she really didn't hide her enthusiasm was when she was going on about authenticity and being true to yourself. She would tell me about her stepmother always wanting her to put some makeup over her freckles to cover them up. "I like my freckles," Wendy would say. So a few weeks later, Wendy was clipping leaves from her beloved plant, and she told me about her boyfriend coming to pick her up one night, and her father coming out of the house and yelling and screaming and acting completely nuts, as she said. I mean, sure, Josh drives a little fast, I remember Wendy saying, but come on. We both shook our heads because we couldn't imagine why her dad would have acted that way. And it wasn't long after that Josh, who had been drinking, was driving Wendy home when, I don't know, he failed to see the sign for the railroad tracks, and their car was hit by that oncoming train, that very train whose whistle I had listened to every night practically of my teen years, and they were both killed on impact. So when I heard the news, the first thing I thought of was that plant, unwatered, unloved. And when I saw Wendy's face in the casket, smooth, waxy, covered in makeup, not a freckle in sight, I wondered why no one had known that this freckle-free face was not the one she would have necessarily wanted the world to see. And so I thought over the years a lot about what would have happened if she had talked about her boyfriend's driving to somebody other than me, to an adult who had given her the gift of his presence. Maybe that could have inspired her to make different choices that might have saved her life. But I'll tell you, she lives on in my memory. She lives on in me in talking about her like this to all of you. And I think of one small moment. It was so insignificant, but I'll share it with you because it always makes me smile. One day, Mrs. Madrigal was standing there prattling away in French, and I was bored looking around the room, and I catch sight of Wendy's eyes, which are fixed on Mrs. Madrigal's foot. So I turned to look there too, and watched in fascination as the teacher's pantyhose, which must have split along the seam at her toes, began to roll up her foot, higher and higher, rolling into a donut-shaped thing at her ankle that crept up her calf higher and higher until it disappeared under her skirt, just as she, oblivious to all of this, threw back her head and said her trademark, "C'est magnifique!" Well, I look back at Wendy, who was now staring at Mrs. Madrigal's bare, lily-white leg. Wendy's astonished gaze met mine, and from across the room, we both burst out laughing. And that face, I'll tell you, that face, freckles on display, eyes full of life and humor and possibility, that's the face I'll always remember. Wendy, who was going to travel the world as a journalist and tell the stories nobody else would dare tell. Who knows what possibilities we lost when we lost Wendy. So where do we go with all this here, now, in this moment? Well, once again, I am inspired by our youth at camp. Picture 100 teens hiking through the nighttime darkness of the forest, boisterous laughter along the way. And then, in silvery moonlight, they all sit, silently meditating and praying, bonded together across differences by the instinctive understanding that our message as Unitarian Universalists is, you are loved. We can follow their example, building relationships across differences that go beyond the surface and reach the core, welcoming those in who, of any age, of any identity. Opportunities abound for all of us to practice presence. It might start as simply as you liking our church Facebook page, because we can't deny that technology, social media, is an entry point into connection building in today's world. Or you might sign up to be a religious education teacher, because there's ample opportunity in working with the children of our congregation to practice presence. This, folks, is how we build the strong community needed, so that when injustice occurs, when a basic affirmative statement such as Black Lives Matter is treated as a threat, or when yet another school shooting occurs, we have the strength and solidarity to both hold each other and take positive action. I told you earlier about that book Mrs. Green's given me. It's gotten lost in the many moves in my lifetime. Nonetheless, just as I remember the unremarkably remarkable Mrs. Green and that inscription with its affirmation of my worth, I wonder if that book is now in some other kid's hands and that she reads that inscription and it reminds her of a Mrs. Green in her own life. And I hope she has one. As I left camp that summer, I thought about what my letter would look like home now. Dear Mother, Father, Mrs. Green, and everybody else. Thanks for being there when needed. You are loved. You are enough. Keep being there for your kids, your grandkids, your neighbors, people you sit next to on Sunday morning. Changing the world doesn't happen just because we have good ideas. It's relational. We have to be in meaningful relationships in order to transform the world for the better. I learned a lot from camp, and while I never got used to the idea of mice in our cabin, I did get earplugs so I could sleep through that snoring, and it was all worthwhile in the end. And to my friend Wendy, I have not forgotten you. We've heard the train whistling, and we will do our best to make sure it stops this time. So anyone who needs a hand has a chance to get on board. No need to come and get me. I'm already here. Sincerely, Jason Mark Brooks. P.S. Nobody has made me play dodgeball.